Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she walked through the small town of Millbrook. The sun was beating down hard, and her old pickup truck had broken down 3 miles back. She was wearing simple jeans and a faded t-shirt, looking like any other person trying to get by in this quiet place. The town wasn't much to look at. A few shops lined the main street, and most people seemed to know each other. Sarah had come here hoping to find some peace after everything she'd been through. She wanted to blend in, to be just another face in the crowd. As she walked past Murphy's diner, she heard loud voices coming from inside. Through the window, she could see a group of men sitting around a large table. They were wearing expensive clothes and had the kind of swagger that made other people step aside. These were the Brennan brothers, Tommy, Mike, and Jake. Everyone in town knew to stay out of their way. The Brennans had been causing trouble in Millbrook for years. They owned several businesses, but everyone suspected they made their real money through less legal means. People whispered about protection rackets, illegal gambling, and, worse, the local police seemed powerless to stop them, or maybe they just didn't want to try. Sarah pushed open the diner door, and the little bell above it rang softly. The place went quiet for a moment as everyone looked at the stranger. She walked to the counter and sat down on one of the worn stools. "What can I get you, honey?" asked Betty, the waitress who'd been working there for 20 years. "Just coffee, please," Sarah said quietly. Behind her, she could hear the Brennan brothers talking loudly again. They were discussing their latest plan to buy out old Mr. Peterson's hardware store. From what Sarah could hear, Mr. Peterson didn't want to sell, but the brothers had ways of making people change their minds. "That old fool thinks he can stand up to us," Tommy Brennan laughed. "We'll see about that." Sarah sipped her coffee and tried to mind her own business. She'd come to this town to escape violence and conflict, not to get involved in more of it. But something about the way the brothers talked about Mr. Peterson bothered her. She remembered the elderly man from when she'd stopped by his store earlier that week. He'd been kind to her, helping her find what she needed and refusing to take payment when he learned she was having car trouble. The coffee was bitter, but it was hot and strong. Sarah stared into the dark liquid and thought about her past. Most people in town assumed she was just a drifter, maybe someone down on her luck. They had no idea what she'd done or where she'd been. That's exactly how she wanted it. Growing up, Sarah had always been different from other girls. While they played with dolls, she was climbing trees and getting into fights with boys twice her size. Her father had been in the military, and he'd taught her that sometimes you had to fight for what was right. Her mother had tried to make her more ladylike, but it never stuck. When Sarah turned 18, she surprised everyone by joining the Navy. Most people expected her to go to college or find a nice boyfriend and settle down. Instead, she chose one of the hardest paths possible. She wanted to prove that she was just as tough as any man. The training had been brutal. Many times, Sarah wanted to quit, but something inside her refused to give up. She pushed herself harder than anyone expected, and slowly, she began to excel. Her instructors noticed that she had something special, a combination of intelligence, physical ability, and mental toughness that was rare. After 2 years in regular Navy service, Sarah was approached about trying out for an elite unit. She couldn't tell her family much about it, only that it involved special operations and would require her to be away for long periods. The selection process was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but somehow she made it through. Now, sitting in this small-town diner, those days felt like another lifetime. Sarah had left all of that behind, or at least she was trying to. She wanted to be normal, to live a quiet life where the biggest worry was whether her truck would start in the morning. The Brennan brothers were getting louder and more aggressive in their conversation. Other customers in the diner looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. This was clearly how things worked in Millbrook. The brothers did whatever they wanted, and everyone else just tried to stay out of their way. Sarah finished her coffee and left $1 on the counter. As she stood to leave, she accidentally bumped into Jake Brennan, who was walking back from the restroom. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, looking her up and down with obvious disdain. "Sorry," Sarah said quietly, trying to step around him. But Jake wasn't done. Maybe it was because she was a stranger, or maybe he just felt like causing trouble. He grabbed her arm roughly. I said, "Watch it. You look like some kind of vagrant anyway. This is a respectable establishment." Sarah looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. For just a moment, something dangerous flashed at her eyes. But then she remembered where she was and what she was trying to be now. "I apologize," she said, her voice steady. "It won't happen again." Jake seemed surprised by her calm response. He'd expected her to either cower in fear or fight back. Instead, she just stood there, waiting for him to let go of her arm. Something about her stillness made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't say why. Just get out of here," he muttered, releasing her arm. Sarah nodded and walked toward the door. Behind her, she could hear the brothers laughing and making crude comments. Every instinct told her to turn around and show them exactly what she was capable of, but she fought those impulses down. She was trying to be someone new now, someone peaceful. As she stepped outside into the afternoon heat, Sarah took a deep breath. The fresh air helped clear her head. She started walking back toward where her truck had broken down, hoping the mechanic she called would show up soon. But as she walked, she couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Peterson and the way the Brennan brothers had talked about him. She'd seen enough bullies in her life to know how this story usually ended. Men like the Brennans didn't take no for an answer, and they usually got their way through intimidation and violence. Sarah told herself it wasn't her problem. She was just passing through this town, trying to mind her own business. Whatever happened between the Brennans and Mr. Peterson was between them. She had no obligation to get involved. Still, the image of the kind old man kept coming back to her. He'd reminded her of her grandfather, who had always been there for her when she was growing up. Mr. Peterson had the same gentle way of speaking and the same genuine concern for others. By the time Sarah reached her truck, she'd made up her mind to stay out of it. She would get her vehicle fixed, maybe spend one more night in Millbrook, and then move on to the next town. She'd find somewhere else to start her new life, somewhere without bullies and conflict. The mechanic arrived an hour later and quickly diagnosed the problem. It would take a day to get the right part, so Sarah was stuck in Millbrook at least until tomorrow. She checked into the small motel on the edge of town and tried to put the Brennan brothers out of her mind. That evening, she walked back into town to find something to eat. Most of the shops were closing, but Peterson's Hardware was still open. Through the window, she could see the old man working alone, organizing inventory on his shelves. Sarah stood outside for several minutes, watching him work. There was something peaceful about the way he moved, carefully arranging each item in its proper place. This was clearly a man who took pride in his work and cared about serving his community. As she watched, a dark sedan pulled up across the street. Sarah recognized Tommy Brennan behind the wheel. He sat there for a few minutes, just staring at the hardware store. The message was clear. He wanted Mr. Peterson to know he was being watched. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists. She'd seen this kind of intimidation before, in places much more dangerous than Millbrook. It always started small, a threatening look, a casual mention of what could happen to someone's business or family. But it escalated quickly if the target didn't give in. After a few more minutes, Tommy drove away. Mr. Peterson had probably never even noticed the car, but Sarah had. She recognized the tactics of someone trying to create fear and pressure. That night, lying in her motel room, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to fall asleep. But every time she closed her eyes, she thought about Mr. Peterson and what might happen to him. She thought about all the times she'd stood by and watched injustice happen, telling herself it wasn't her responsibility. Tomorrow, she told herself she would get her truck fixed and leave Millbrook behind. Whatever happened after that wasn't her problem. She'd done enough fighting for one lifetime. Now she just wanted peace. But deep down, Sarah knew that some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. And something told her that her time in Millbrook wasn't over yet. The next morning brought bad news. The mechanic called Sarah's motel room to tell her that the part he needed was backordered. It would be at least 3 more days before her truck would be ready. Sarah hung up the phone and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling trapped. She walked into town for breakfast, hoping to keep a low profile. But as she passed Peterson's hardware, she could see that something was wrong. The front window had been cracked, and there were dark stains on the sidewalk that looked like motor oil. Mr. Peterson was outside with a bucket and mop cleaning up the mess. "Excuse me," Sarah said, approaching him carefully. "Are you okay? What happened here?" Mr. Peterson looked up, and she could see that his face was pale and worried. His hand shook slightly as he wrung out the mop. "Oh, hello there," he said, trying to force a smile. "You're the young lady who was in here the other day, aren't you? Just a little accident. Nothing to worry about." But Sarah could tell he was lying. The accident had been very carefully planned. Someone had thrown motor oil against his window and probably made some threats while they were at it. This was escalation. The Brennan brothers were turning up the pressure. "Mr. Peterson," Sarah said gently, "if someone's giving you trouble, maybe you should call the police." The old man let out a bitter laugh. "The police? Honey, the police in this town know better than to get involved with certain people. I appreciate your concern, but this is just something I have to handle on my own." Sarah watched him continue cleaning, his movements slow and tired. This wasn't fair. Mr. Peterson was a good man who'd spent his life serving this community, and now he was being terrorized by thugs who saw his business as easy money. That afternoon, Sarah found herself walking past the hardware store again. She told herself she was just exploring the town, but really she was checking on Mr. Peterson. Through the window, she could see him helping a customer, still maintaining his friendly demeanor despite everything. Around 4 o'clock, the Brennan brothers showed up. All three of them walked into the store together, and Sarah positioned herself where she could see what was happening through the window. The conversation started friendly enough, but Sarah could read body language. The brothers were standing too close to Mr. Peterson, using their size to intimidate him. Tommy was doing most of the talking, while Mike and Jake flanked the old man, blocking his escape routes. Sarah couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see Mr. Peterson shaking his head repeatedly. His face was getting redder, and his hands were trembling. The brothers were clearly making their final offer, and it wasn't really an offer at all. After about 10 minutes, the brothers left. They were laughing and slapping each other on the back as they walked out. Mr. Peterson stood alone in his store, looking defeated and scared. Sarah waited until the brothers were gone, then went inside. "Mr. Peterson, are you all right?" He looked up, startled. For a moment, she thought he might break down and tell her everything. But then he straightened up and put on his brave face again. "Oh yes, fine. Those boys were just discussing business. Nothing for you to worry about, dear." But Sarah could see the truth in his eyes. The Brennan brothers had given him some kind of ultimatum, and time was running out. That evening, Sarah sat in the motel restaurant, picking at a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. The food wasn't bad, but she had no appetite. Her mind kept going back to Mr. Peterson and the fear she'd seen in his eyes. She'd been in situations like this before, in places much more dangerous than a small American town. She'd seen what happened when good people were left to face bullies alone. Usually, it didn't end well. Sarah thought about her time in Somalia, where she'd been part of a mission to stop a warlord who was terrorizing innocent civilians. The situation had been complex, with political implications she barely understood. But on the ground level, it was simple. There were bad people hurting good people, and someone had to stop them. The warlord Hassan Omar had been running a brutal operation in the northern part of the country. His fighters would raid villages, steal everything of value, and kill anyone who resisted. The local government was too weak to stop him, and the international community seemed more interested in talking than acting. Sarah's team had been sent in to gather intelligence, but intelligence gathering had quickly turned into direct action. They'd tracked Hassan Omar to his compound and discovered he was planning a major attack on a refugee camp. Thousands of innocent people would have died if they hadn't acted. The mission had been dangerous and complicated. Sarah had to infiltrate the compound alone while her team created a distraction. She'd spent 3 days moving through enemy territory, avoiding patrols, and gathering information about Hassan Omar's plans and defenses. When the time came for action, everything had gone wrong. The distraction failed, and Sarah found herself trapped inside the compound with dozens of armed fighters looking for her. She had to use every skill she'd learned to fight her way out and complete the mission. The details of what happened next were classified, but Sarah remembered every moment. She remembered the weight of her weapon, the sound of gunfire, and the look in Hassan Omar's eyes when he realized his reign of terror was over. Most of all, she remembered the faces of the refugees when they learned they were safe. That mission had earned Sarah commendations and respect from her superiors, but it had also changed her. She'd seen too much violence, made too many hard choices. When her enlistment was up, she decided not to re-enter. She wanted to find a different way to live, one that didn't involve life and death decisions. But sitting in this small-town restaurant, Sarah realized that some things never changed. There were still bullies threatening innocent people, still situations where someone had to make a choice between standing up and walking away. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a plan. She would talk to Mr. Peterson one more time, try to convince him to reach out to state or federal authorities. Maybe there was a legal way to handle the Brennan brothers without anyone getting hurt. She found Mr. Peterson opening his store, moving slowly and looking like he hadn't slept much. His hands were shaking as he unlocked the door. "Mr. Peterson," Sarah said, approaching him carefully. "I know this isn't my business, but I'm worried about you. Is there anything I can do to help?" The old man looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with whether to trust her. "I don't even know your name," he said finally. Sarah Martinez." "Well, Sarah, I appreciate your concern. I really do. But this is a local matter. It'll work itself out." "Will it?" Sarah asked. "Because from what I can see, those men aren't going to give up. They want your store, and they're not going to take no for an answer." Mr. Peterson's shoulders sagged. "What do you want me to do? I've run this store for 30 years. My father ran it before me. It's all I know, all I have. But I'm 72 years old, and I'm tired of being afraid. Have you tried calling the FBI or the state attorney general's office? If these men are involved in organized crime, with what proof?" Mr. Peterson interrupted. "They're careful. They never actually threaten you directly. They just make suggestions, talk about how accidents can happen to businesses that don't have proper protection." Sarah felt a familiar anger building inside her. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd hoped to leave behind, but here it was again. Innocent people being hurt by those with more power, and everyone else too scared or indifferent to help. What if someone stood up to them? Sarah asked. What if they knew they couldn't just push people around anymore? Mr. Peterson looked at her with surprise. "Sarah, honey, these aren't playground bullies. The Brennan brothers are dangerous men with dangerous friends. People who cross them tend to disappear or have terrible accidents. I won't have that on my conscience. But what's the alternative? Let them take everything you've worked for. Maybe that's better than getting someone killed," Mr. Peterson said sadly. That afternoon, Sarah learned that the Brennan brothers had given Mr. Peterson until Friday to make his decision. Today was Wednesday. In 2 days, one way or another, this situation would be resolved. Sarah spent the rest of the day walking around Millbrook, thinking. The town was actually quite beautiful when you looked past the main street. There were tree-lined neighborhoods with well-kept houses, a small park where children played, and a sense of community that reminded her of where she'd grown up. But there was also fear. She could see it in the way people looked over their shoulders, the way conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. The Brennan brothers had created an atmosphere where good people lived in constant anxiety about what might happen if they stepped out of line. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to stand by and watch Mr. Peterson be destroyed by these bullies. She'd spent too many years fighting for strangers in foreign countries to ignore injustice in her own backyard. But she would try to handle this the smart way first. She would gather information, document the Brennan brothers' activities, and find a way to bring them down legally. Violence would be a last resort. Sarah spent the night planning her approach. She would need to be careful and methodical. The Brennan brothers might look like small-town criminals, but if they'd been operating this long without consequences, they were probably smarter and more dangerous than they appeared. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah thought about Hassan Omar and how surprised he'd looked when a woman had appeared in his compound. Sometimes the best weapon against a bully was the element of surprise. The Brennan brothers had no idea what was coming for them. They thought they were dealing with a scared old man and a town full of people too frightened to fight back. They had no idea that someone with Sarah's particular set of skills had just decided to get involved. Friday was still 2 days away. That gave Sarah time to learn everything she could about her enemies and plan her next move. The game was about to change in Millbrook, and the Brennan brothers wouldn't know what hit them Thursday morning. Sarah began her reconnaissance. She learned a long time ago that information was often more valuable than weapons. If she was going to help Mr. Peterson, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. The Brennan brothers operated out of a large building on the edge of town that officially housed their construction company. Sarah spent the morning watching from a distance, noting who came and went. The traffic was heavier than you'd expect for a small construction business. Men in expensive cars would arrive, stay for short meetings, and leave quickly. Around noon, Sarah saw something that confirmed her suspicions. A man in a suit arrived, driving a car with out-of-state plates. He stayed inside the building for about an hour, and when he left, one of the Brennan brothers walked him to his car, carrying a large briefcase. This wasn't construction business. This was something much more serious. That afternoon, Sarah visited the town library and used their computer to research the Brennan brothers. What she found was interesting. Their construction company had won several major contracts in the past few years, often beating out more established competitors. Their bids were consistently just low enough to win, which suggested they had inside information. She also found records of several businesses in town that had been sold to the Brennan brothers over the past 5 years. In each case, the previous owners had faced a series of accidents and problems before finally selling out at below-market prices. The pattern was clear, and Mr. Peterson was just the latest target. But the most disturbing thing Sarah discovered was a newspaper article from 2 years ago. A local businessman named Frank Kowalski had tried to organize other store owners to stand up to the Brennan brothers. 3 days after the article was published, Frank had died in what police called a single-car accident. His car had gone off a curve on a road he'd driven safely for 20 years. Sarah sat back in the library chair, feeling cold despite the warm afternoon. Frank Kowalski's accident might have been legitimate, but the timing was suspicious. If the Brennan brothers were willing to kill to protect their operation, then Mr. Peterson was in more danger than he realized. That evening, Sarah decided to get a closer look at the Brennan brothers building. She waited until after dark, then made her way across the empty lot behind the structure. The building had several windows, but most were covered. However, she found one that gave her a view into what looked like an office. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. The walls were covered with photographs and maps. Some of the photos showed local businesses, including Peterson's Hardware. Others showed people, business owners, local politicians, even the police chief. Red X marks had been drawn over several of the faces. There were also maps showing routes in and out of town, marked with times and dates. This wasn't a simple protection racket. This was a sophisticated criminal organization with connections well beyond Millbrook. As Sarah watched, Tommy Brennan entered the office with another man she didn't recognize. They began discussing something while pointing at the photos on the wall. Sarah couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested they were planning something big. She was about to leave when she heard footsteps behind her. Sarah turned to see Jake Brennan approaching with 2 other men. They must have spotted her surveillance and circled around to cut off her escape. Well, Jake said, his voice full of menace. Look what we have here. The little vagrant from the diner, playing spy games. Sarah calculated her options quickly. 3 men, probably armed, and she was caught in the open with limited cover. Not ideal, but she'd been in worse situations. "I was just taking a walk," she said, keeping her voice calm and non-threatening. "I got lost and was trying to figure out where I was." Jake laughed. "Lost? Right behind our building? That's a pretty convenient kind of lost." The other two men spread out, trying to flank her. Sarah noticed that one of them had a gun bulge under his jacket. This was escalating quickly. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Sarah said, backing away slowly. "I'm just passing through town. I'll be gone in a day or two." "Oh, you'll be gone all right," Jake said, pulling out a knife. "The question is whether you'll be walking out or getting carried out." That's when Sarah's training kicked in. Years of military experience had taught her to recognize the moment when talking stops working. Jake was committed to violence now. She could see it in his eyes. When Jake lunged with the knife, Sarah was ready. She sidestepped the attack and used his momentum against him, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The second man reached for his gun, but Sarah was already moving. She closed the distance before he could draw, striking him in the solar plexus and then the temple. He dropped like a stone. The third man hesitated, unsure what he'd just witnessed. In that moment of uncertainty, Sarah acted. She swept his legs and put him down hard, then quickly checked to make sure he wouldn't be getting back up soon. The entire fight had lasted less than 30 seconds. Jake was groaning in the dirt, the armed man was unconscious, and the third attacker was curled up holding his ribs. Sarah checked each of them quickly, then melted back into the shadows before anyone else could arrive. As she made her way back to the motel, Sarah's mind was racing. She'd blown her cover now. The Brennan brothers would know that someone in town was more dangerous than they appeared. They'd also be angry and humiliated, which would make them more unpredictable. But Sarah had also learned something crucial. The Brennan brothers were part of something much bigger than a small-town protection racket. The photos and maps in their office suggested connections to organized crime, possibly even human trafficking or drug distribution. Mr. Peterson wasn't just facing local bullies. He was up against a serious criminal organization. Back in her motel room, Sarah sat on the bed and tried to think through her next move. Tomorrow was Friday, the deadline the Brennan brothers had given Mr. Peterson. If she was going to help him, she was running out of time. She could try to convince Mr. Peterson to leave town, but that would mean abandoning everything he'd worked for. It would also mean letting the Brennan brothers win, and they'd just move on to their next victim. Sarah could try to contact federal law enforcement, but she had no solid proof of criminal activity. Everything she'd seen could be explained away, and it would take time to build a case. Time that Mr. Peterson didn't have. Or she could take direct action. Sarah had the skills to neutralize the Brennan brothers, but that would mean returning to the kind of violence she'd hoped to leave behind. It would also make her a fugitive, forcing her to run for the rest of her life. As she lay in bed that night, Sarah thought about Hassan Omar and the refugee camp in Somalia. Sometimes there were no good choices, only necessary ones. Sometimes the only way to protect innocent people was to stop those who would hurt them, whatever the cost. Friday morning came too soon. Sarah woke up knowing that today would determine Mr. Peterson's fate and probably her own. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would allow her to move freely if things went bad. Then, she walked into town to see what the day would bring. Mr. Peterson's store was open, but Sarah could see that the old man was barely holding himself together. His hands shook as he arranged items on the shelves, and he jumped at every sound. He knew the deadline was today, and he knew the Brennan brothers would be coming for their answer. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah saw the dark sedan pull up outside the hardware store. All three Brennan brothers got out, along with two men she didn't recognize. Jake was moving stiffly. Apparently, he was still feeling the effects of last night's encounter. The five men walked into Peterson's hardware like they owned the place. Through the window, Sarah could see them surrounding Mr. Peterson near the back of the store. The conversation was brief and one-sided. The Brennan brothers were done negotiating. After a few minutes, the men left the store. But instead of driving away, they positioned themselves around the building. They were making sure Mr. Peterson understood that he was trapped. Sarah watched from across the street, her mind working furiously. She could see what was happening. The Brennan brothers were going to maintain pressure on Mr. Peterson until he broke. They'd probably keep someone watching him at all times, making his life miserable until he agreed to sell. It was a cruel but effective strategy. Most people would eventually crack under that kind of psychological pressure. The Brennan brothers could afford to wait, but Mr. Peterson couldn't. That's when Sarah made her decision. She tried to find a peaceful solution, but the Brennan brothers had made that impossible. If they wanted to use fear and intimidation to get what they wanted, then they were about to learn what real fear felt like. Sarah spent the rest of the morning making preparations. She scouted escape routes, identified defensive positions, and planned her approach. If she was going to do this, she would do it right. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in town became almost unbearable. Word had spread that something was happening at Peterson's Hardware. People stayed indoors and avoided the main street. Even the police seemed to be making themselves scarce. Around 4 o'clock, Sarah saw Tommy Brennan walk back into the hardware store alone. This was it. He was going to make the final demand. Whatever Mr. Peterson's answer was, it would determine what happened next. Sarah crossed the street and positioned herself near the store's front window. She could hear raised voices from inside, and she could see that Tommy was getting aggressive with Mr. Peterson. That's when everything went wrong. Tommy grabbed the old man by the shirt and shoved him hard against a shelf of paint cans. Several cans fell to the floor, creating a loud crash that echoed through the store. Mr. Peterson stumbled and fell, hitting his head on the corner of a display case. Blood began trickling from a cut on his forehead, and he looked dazed and confused. Tommy stood over him, laughing. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Looks like you had an accident, old man. Good thing I was here to witness it." Sarah felt something snap inside her. She'd seen enough bullies, enough innocent people getting hurt while others stood by and did nothing. Not today. Not anymore. She pushed open the door to Peterson's Hardware and stepped inside. Tommy looked up, surprised to see her. "Store's closed," he said arrogantly. "You'll have to come back later." Sarah looked at Mr. Peterson, who was trying to sit up while blood ran down his face. Then she looked at Tommy Brennan, who was still standing over the old man with a smirk on his face. "Actually," Sarah said quietly, "I think you're the one who needs to leave." Tommy Brennan looked at Sarah with a mixture of amusement and irritation. He was a big man, used to people backing down when he showed aggression. This small woman telling him to leave struck him as almost funny. "Lady, you have no idea what you're walking into," he said, taking a step toward her. "This is between me and Peterson. Walk away now, and maybe you won't get hurt." Sarah didn't move. She stood calmly in the doorway, blocking his exit. "Mr. Peterson is hurt. He needs medical attention. I think you should go." Tommy's amusement turned to anger. Nobody talked to him like that in his own town. "You know what? I think you need to learn some respect." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol. Not to shoot her, just to scare her. In Tommy's experience, the sight of a gun was usually enough to make people cooperative. But Sarah didn't look scared. If anything, she looked disappointed. "That's not a very good idea," she said. Tommy was getting frustrated. This woman wasn't reacting the way people were supposed to react. "Shut up and get on the ground, or I'll put you there myself." "No," Sarah said simply. That's when Tommy made his mistake. He reached out to grab her, thinking he could force her to comply. But the moment his hand touched her arm, Sarah moved. What happened next was so fast that Mr. Peterson, still dazed from his fall, couldn't quite follow it. 1 second Tommy was holding a gun and reaching for Sarah. The next second he was on the floor, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle, screaming in pain. The gun had somehow ended up in Sarah's hand. "Stay down," Sarah told him calmly. "Don't make this worse than it already is." But Tommy was too angry and humiliated to think clearly. He tried to get up, reaching for a backup weapon with his good arm. Sarah sighed and moved again. This time, Tommy didn't get back up. She knelt beside Mr. Peterson and examined his head wound. It wasn't as bad as it had looked. head wounds always bled heavily. But the old man was clearly shaken. "Are you okay, Mr. Peterson?" she asked gently. Yes, I think so." "Sarah, what just happened? Who are you?" Before Sarah could answer, she heard car doors slamming outside. Through the window, she could see Mike and Jake Brennan running toward the store along with their two associates. They'd heard the commotion and were coming to help their brother. "Mr. Peterson, I need you to get behind that counter and stay down," Sarah said urgently. "This isn't over yet." The four men burst through the door, expecting to find Tommy in control of the situation. Instead, they found him unconscious on the floor and Sarah standing over him with his gun. "What the hell?" Mike Brennan shouted. He was the oldest brother and supposedly the smartest, but right now he looked confused and angry. Jake recognized Sarah from their encounter the night before. "It's her. She's the one who jumped us behind the building." Sarah found herself facing four men in a small space with limited room to maneuver. The situation was dangerous, but she'd faced worse odds before. In Somalia, she'd been alone against an entire compound of hostile fighters. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice steady. "You're going to pick up your brother and leave. You're going to stop bothering Mr. Peterson, and you're going to find a new town to operate in." Mike laughed harshly. "Lady, you are seriously out of your mind. Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" "Local criminals who think they're tougher than they are," Sarah replied. "I've dealt with your type before." That's when Jake lost his temper. He pulled a knife and charged at her, just like he had the night before. But this time, Sarah didn't hold back. She disarmed him efficiently and put him down hard. The knife went flying and embedded itself in a wooden post. The two associates hesitated, suddenly realizing that this wasn't going according to plan. Mike was starting to look worried. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Someone who doesn't like bullies," Sarah said. One of the associates, a man with a scar across his cheek, decided to test her. He drew his gun and pointed at Sarah. "Drop the weapon, lady, or this gets ugly." Sarah moved like lightning. She threw herself sideways behind a display case just as the man fired. The shot went wide, shattering a window. Before he could fire again, Sarah was moving, using the store's layout to her advantage. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Sarah used every piece of cover available: display cases, shelving units, even bags of potting soil. She moved through the store like a ghost, appearing long enough to take a shot and then vanishing again. Her opponents were dangerous but undisciplined. They fired too quickly and revealed their positions. Within minutes, both associates were down, and Mike Brennan was backing toward the door with his hands raised. "This isn't over," he said, trying to sound threatening despite his obvious fear. "You have no idea what you've started." "Actually, I'm ending it," Sarah replied. She picked up Tommy's unconscious form and dragged him toward Mike. "Take your brothers and get out of town. If I see any of you again, or if anything happens to Mr. Peterson, I'll finish what we started here." Mike helped his injured brothers to their feet, and they stumbled out of the store. Sarah watched through the broken window as they loaded into their sedan and drove away quickly. The hardware store was a mess. There were broken displays, spilled paint, and bullet holes in the walls. Mr. Peterson emerged from behind the counter, looking shocked. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what just happened here? Who are you?" Sarah set Tommy's gun on the counter and looked around at the damage. "I'm sorry about your store, Mr. Peterson. I'll help you clean up." "That's not what I'm asking," the old man said firmly. "Those men have been terrorizing this town for years. Nobody has ever stood up to them like that. The way you moved, the way you fought, that wasn't luck or anger. That was training." Sarah sat down heavily on a bag of fertilizer. She was tired of running from her past, tired of pretending to be someone she wasn't. "I used to be in the military," she said finally. "Special operations. I was involved in some difficult missions overseas." "How difficult?" Mr. Peterson asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about Somalia, about Hassan Omar, and about the mission that had made her famous within certain circles, but unknown to the general public. Hassan Omar was a warlord who controlled a large area in northern Somalia, she began. His fighters were brutal. They would raid villages, kill civilians, take everything of value. The local government couldn't stop him because he had too many men and too much firepower. Mr. Peterson listened intently as Sarah described the mission. How her team had been sent to gather intelligence. How they discovered Omar's plan to attack a refugee camp. How the mission had gone wrong, and Sarah had found herself alone deep in enemy territory. The camp held about 3,000 people, Sarah continued. Families who had fled fighting in other parts of the country. They had nowhere else to go, no way to defend themselves. If Omar's attack succeeded, most of them would die. What did you do? Mr. Peterson asked. What I had to do, Sarah said simply. I infiltrated Omar's compound during a sandstorm. He was planning to launch his attack the next morning. I had maybe 6 hours to stop him. Sarah described moving through the compound, avoiding patrols, gathering intelligence about Omar's plans and defenses. She told Mr. Peterson about finding the weapons cache, about discovering how many fighters Omar commanded, about realizing that a conventional assault would fail. So, I changed the mission, Sarah said. Instead of just gathering intelligence, I decided to end the threat permanently. You went after Omar directly? I had to. He was the center of everything. Without him, his organization would collapse. But getting to him meant going through about 50 armed guards. Mr. Peterson shook his head in amazement. How did you possibly manage that? Sarah smiled grimly. Very carefully, and with a lot of help from that sandstorm. I used the chaos to my advantage, turned his own men against each other, created confusion and panic. She described the final confrontation with Hassan Omar himself, how she'd found him in his private quarters, planning the attack on the refugee camp, how he tried to negotiate, then threaten, then fight. In the end, Sarah said, it came down to him or 3,000 innocent people. That's not really a choice at all. You killed him. I stopped him, Sarah said. The details are classified, but the refugee camp never came under attack. Omar's organization fell apart within days. Those 3,000 people got to live. Mr. Peterson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, and now you're here, helping an old man save his hardware store. It's the same thing, Sarah said. Bullies hurting innocent people. The scale is different, but the principle is the same. Outside, they could hear sirens approaching. Someone had called the police about the gunshots. Sarah knew she'd have some explaining to do. Mr. Peterson, she said urgently, when the police get here, tell them the Brennan brothers came in demanding money, and things got violent. Tell them I was just a customer who tried to help. Don't mention anything about Somalia or my military background. But, Sarah, you're a hero. People should know what you've done. Sarah shook her head. Heroes don't go around shooting people in hardware stores. I came to this town to start over, to be someone normal. If people find out who I really am, I'll never have a quiet life. The police cars pulled up outside, their red and blue lights flashing through the broken window. Sarah could see officers getting out, weapons drawn. Promise me, Mr. Peterson, Sarah said. Just tell them I was defending myself and trying to help you. Nothing more. The old man nodded reluctantly. I promise. But, Sarah, you saved more than just my store today. You saved this whole town from those men. As the police entered the hardware store, Sarah raised her hands to show she wasn't armed. She had a story ready about being a customer who'd gotten caught up in a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was close enough. What she didn't know was that Jake Brennan was already making phone calls from a hospital. The Brennan brothers might have been local criminals, but they had connections to much more dangerous people. And those people were very interested in learning more about the woman who had single-handedly destroyed their Millbrook operation. Sarah's quiet new life was about to become much more complicated. The police questioning lasted 3 hours. Detective Ray Morrison was thorough, but fair, and Sarah could tell he was relieved to finally have a reason to investigate the Brennan brothers. Her story about being an innocent customer who'd fought back during a robbery attempt held up under scrutiny, especially with Mr. Peterson backing her up. You're lucky you weren't killed, Detective Morrison told her as they finished up. The Brennan brothers have been suspected of much worse than robbery. You might have saved Mr. Peterson's life today. Sarah nodded and said all the right things about being scared and just trying to help. Inside, she felt tired. She'd hoped to leave this kind of violence behind, but somehow it kept finding her. After the police released her, Sarah helped Mr. Peterson board up his broken window and clean up the worst of the damage. The old man was quiet as they worked, processing everything that had happened. "The insurance will cover most of this," he said finally, "and I guess I won't have to worry about selling to the Brennan brothers anymore." "No, you won't," Sarah agreed. "But, Mr. Peterson, you should be careful for the next few weeks. Men like that sometimes have friends who might want revenge." The old man looked at her thoughtfully. "What about you? Are you going to be safe?" Sarah had been wondering the same thing. The smart move would be to leave Millbrook immediately, before word of what had happened spread to the wrong people. But her truck still wasn't ready, and something made her want to stay and make sure Mr. Peterson would truly be safe. That evening, Sarah sat in her motel room and tried to plan her next move. She'd used her real name with the police, which meant there would be a record of her being here. If anyone came looking for information about the woman who defeated the Brennan brothers, they'd be able to find her. Around midnight, Sarah heard vehicles pulling into the motel parking lot. Through her window, she could see several cars with out-of-state plates. Men in expensive suits were getting out and talking in low voices. These weren't locals, and they weren't here for tourism. Sarah quickly gathered her few belongings and slipped out the back window of her room. She learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming that danger was approaching. From the shadows behind the motel, she watched as the suited men entered the building. One of them was talking on a cell phone, probably coordinating with others. Within minutes, they would discover that her room was empty. Sarah made her way through the darkness toward the center of town. She needed to warn Mr. Peterson and then figure out how to get out of Millbrook. But as she approached the hardware store, she saw that she was too late. More cars were parked outside Peterson's house across the street, and she could see figures moving around the building. These men weren't here to talk. They were here to send a message about what happened to people who interfered with their business. Mr. Peterson was in serious danger, and it was Sarah's fault for getting him involved. Sarah circled around to the back of Peterson's house and found an unlocked window. She slipped inside quietly and made her way toward the front of the house. She could hear voices in the living room, at least 3 men plus Mr. Peterson. "We know you're lying, old man," one voice was saying. "Nobody fights off 5 trained men by themselves. You had help, professional help. We want to know who she is." "I already told you," Mr. Peterson replied, his voice shaky but defiant. "She was just a customer who happened to be there. I don't know anything about her background." "Wrong answer," another voice said. There was the sound of something heavy hitting flesh, and Mr. Peterson cried out in pain. Sarah felt the familiar cold anger building inside her. These men had come into an innocent man's home and were torturing him for information. Some lines should never be crossed. She moved through the house like a shadow, using skills learned in hostile territory around the world. There were 4 men in the living room, all focused on Mr. Peterson, who was tied to a chair. They'd made the mistake of not posting a guard. Sarah appeared in the doorway like a ghost. The men were so surprised that for a moment nobody moved. "Let him go," Sarah said quietly. The leader of the group, a thin man with cold eyes, was the first to recover. Well, the mysterious, helpful customer. "We've been looking for you. You found me. Now, let Mr. Peterson go. Your problem is with me, not him." The thin man smiled without warmth. "Our problem is with anyone who interferes with our business. But you're right. You're the one we really want to talk to." He gestured to his men, and they spread out to surround Sarah. These weren't local thugs like the Brennan brothers. These were professionals, and they moved with the coordination of a trained team. "You know," the thin man continued, "we did some checking on you after what happened this afternoon." Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL, veteran of several classified operations in Somalia and Afghanistan. Very impressive resume. Sarah's heart sank. If they knew her real background, then her cover was completely blown. She'd never be able to disappear into a quiet civilian life now. The people we work for are very interested in your skills, the man went on. They'd like to offer you a job. Very lucrative, very flexible in terms of methods. Not interested, Sarah said. Oh, but you should be, because the alternative is much less pleasant. For you and for your friend here. That's when Sarah noticed that one of the men had a gun pointed at Mr. Peterson's head. They were using the old man as leverage, knowing that Sarah wouldn't act if it meant getting him killed. Here's how this works, the thin man said. You come with us quietly, and the old man lives. You resist, and he dies right now. Then you die, and we burn this whole town down looking for anyone else who might know about your little heroics today. Sarah found herself in an impossible situation. If she fought, Mr. Peterson would die. If she surrendered, she'd probably be forced to work for criminals for the rest of her life. Either way, her attempt at a normal life was over. But then she remembered something from her Somalia mission. Sometimes the best strategy was to change the rules of the game entirely. You're right, Sarah said, raising her hands in apparent surrender. I'll come with you. Just don't hurt him. The thin man smiled triumphantly. I thought you'd see reason. Boss will be pleased. But as his men moved to restrain her, Sarah acted. She'd been counting on their overconfidence, and they didn't disappoint. The moment they relaxed their guard, thinking she'd given up, Sarah struck. What followed was the most dangerous fight of her life. These men were professionals, well-trained and well-armed. But Sarah had something they didn't, desperation and a willingness to take risks they couldn't imagine. She used every dirty trick she'd learned in special operations, every skill that had kept her alive in the world's most dangerous places. The fight ranged through Peterson's house, destroying furniture and putting holes in the walls. When it was over, 3 of the men were unconscious, and the 4th was groaning on the floor with a broken arm. The thin man had tried to run, but made it only as far as the front porch before Sarah caught up with him. Who do you work for? She demanded, holding him down. You have no idea what you've done, he gasped. They'll never stop looking for you now. You can't hide from these people. Watch me, Sarah said, and knocked him unconscious. She quickly untied Mr. Peterson, who was bruised but not seriously injured. Are you okay? I think so, he said, looking around at the destruction in his living room. Sarah, these men knew about your military service. How is that possible? Sarah helped him to a chair and checked his injuries. I don't know, but it means I can't stay here anymore. They'll keep coming until they find me. Where will you go? I'll figure something out. But, Mr. Peterson, you need to leave town for a while, too. These people might come back looking for you. The old man shook his head. I've lived in this town for 72 years. I'm not running now. This isn't like the Brennan brothers, Sarah warned. These are serious criminals with connections across the country. They won't give up. Neither will I, Mr. Peterson said firmly. Besides, they're not looking for me anymore. They're looking for you. Sarah realized he was right. She'd become the target now, which meant Mr. Peterson would be safe as long as she stayed away from him. It was time to disappear again, to find a new identity and a new place to start over. But first, she had some calls to make. The thin man was right about one thing. She couldn't hide from these people using normal methods. But Sarah had resources from her military days, connections that could help her disappear completely. As dawn broke over Millbrook, Sarah was already gone. She'd slipped out of town before sunrise, leaving no trace of where she was headed. The men who'd come looking for her would wake up in police custody with no memory of exactly what had happened to them. Detective Morrison found them tied up in Peterson's backyard with a note explaining that they'd been involved in the hardware store incident and had come back for revenge. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough to put them away for a long time. 3 weeks later, Mr. Peterson received a postcard with no return address. The picture showed a beach somewhere tropical, and the message was brief. Store looks great. Glad you decided to stay. Take care of yourself. He smiled and put the postcard in his desk drawer. The hardware store had been repaired and was busier than ever. Word had spread about how someone had finally stood up to the Brennan brothers, and people were coming from towns away to shop there. Mr. Peterson had become something of a local hero, though he always deflected credit to the customer who'd helped him out. The Brennan brothers themselves were in federal prison, charged with racketeering, extortion, and weapons violations. The investigation that followed Sarah's actions had uncovered evidence of a criminal network that stretched across 3 states. Dozens of arrests had been made, and several small towns like Millbrook were finally free from fear. Sarah herself had vanished completely. The professionals who'd come looking for her found no trace of where she'd gone or what identity she was using now. She'd become a ghost, which was exactly what she'd intended. Somewhere in the Caribbean, a woman with dark hair and sunglasses sat at a beachside cafe reading a newspaper. The headline mentioned the conclusion of a major criminal investigation and the conviction of several organized crime figures. She smiled slightly and turned the page. The woman's name was Maria Santos now, and according to her documents, she was a retired teacher from Costa Rica. She'd rented a small apartment near the beach and was taking Spanish lessons to perfect her accent. It was a quiet life, peaceful and anonymous. But sometimes late at night, Maria would stand on her balcony and look out at the ocean. She'd think about Mr. Peterson and his hardware store, about Hassan Omar and the refugee camp in Somalia, about all the places where she'd made a difference. She'd chosen peace over conflict, anonymity over recognition. But she knew that if she ever encountered another bully threatening innocent people, if she ever found herself in a situation where someone needed help and no one else would provide it, she wouldn't be able to walk away. Some people are born to fight for others, even when it costs them everything. Sarah Martinez, the woman who neutralized a Somali warlord and saved a small American town, was one of those people. And even though she'd disappeared into a new life, that part of her would never change. The beach was beautiful and peaceful, but Sarah knew it was only temporary. Somewhere, someday, someone would need her help again. When that time came, she'd be ready. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she walked through the small town of Millbrook. The sun was beating down hard, and her old pickup truck had broken down 3 miles back. She was wearing simple jeans and a faded t-shirt, looking like any other person trying to get by in this quiet place. The town wasn't much to look at. A few shops lined the main street, and most people seemed to know each other. Sarah had come here hoping to find some peace after everything she'd been through. She wanted to blend in, to be just another face in the crowd. As she walked past Murphy's Diner, she heard loud voices coming from inside. Through the window, she could see a group of men sitting around a large table. They were wearing expensive clothes and had the kind of swagger that made other people step aside. These were the Brennan brothers, Tommy, Mike, and Jake. Everyone in town knew to stay out of their way. The Brennans had been causing trouble in Millbrook for years. They owned several businesses, but everyone suspected they made their real money through less legal means. People whispered about protection rackets, illegal gambling, and worse. The local police seemed powerless to stop them, or maybe they just didn't want to try. Sarah pushed open the diner door, and the little bell above it rang softly. The place went quiet for a moment as everyone looked at the stranger. She walked to the counter and sat down on one of the worn stools. "What can I get you, honey?" asked Betty, the waitress who'd been working there for 20 years. "Just coffee, please," Sarah said quietly. Behind her, she could hear the Brennan brothers talking loudly again. They were discussing their latest plan to buy out old Mr. Peterson's hardware store. From what Sarah could hear, Mr. Peterson didn't want to sell, but the brothers had ways of making people change their minds. "That old fool thinks he can stand up to us," Tommy Brennan laughed. "We'll see about that." Sarah sipped her coffee and tried to mind her own business. She'd come to this town to escape violence and conflict, not to get involved in more of it. But something about the way the brothers talked about Mr. Peterson bothered her. She remembered the elderly man from when she'd stopped by his store earlier that week. He'd been kind to her, helping her find what she needed and refusing to take payment when he learned she was having car trouble. The coffee was bitter, but it was hot and strong. Sarah stared into the dark liquid and thought about her past. Most people in town assumed she was just a drifter, maybe someone down on her luck. They had no idea what she'd done or where she'd been. That's exactly how she wanted it. Growing up, Sarah had always been different from other girls. While they played with dolls, she was climbing trees and getting into fights with boys twice her size. Her father had been in the military, and he'd taught her that sometimes you had to fight for what was right. Her mother had tried to make her more ladylike, but it never stuck. When Sarah turned 18, she surprised everyone by joining the Navy. Most people expected her to go to college or find a nice boyfriend and settle down. Instead, she chose one of the hardest paths possible. She wanted to prove that she was just as tough as any man. The training had been brutal. Many times, Sarah wanted to quit, but something inside her refused to give up. She pushed herself harder than anyone expected, and slowly, she began to excel. Her instructors noticed that she had something special, a combination of intelligence, physical ability, and mental toughness that was rare. After 2 years in regular Navy service, Sarah was approached about trying out for an elite unit. She couldn't tell her family much about it, only that it involved special operations and would require her to be away for long periods. The selection process was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but somehow she made it through. Now, sitting in this small-town diner, those days felt like another lifetime. Sarah had left all of that behind, or at least she was trying to. She wanted to be normal, to live a quiet life where the biggest worry was whether her truck would start in the morning. The Brennan brothers were getting louder and more aggressive in their conversation. Other customers in the diner looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. This was clearly how things worked in Millbrook. The brothers did whatever they wanted, and everyone else just tried to stay out of their way. Sarah finished her coffee and left $1 on the counter. As she stood to leave, she accidentally bumped into Jake Brennan, who was walking back from the restroom. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, looking her up and down with obvious disdain. "Sorry," Sarah said quietly, trying to step around him. But Jake wasn't done. Maybe it was because she was a stranger, or maybe he just felt like causing trouble. He grabbed her arm roughly. "I said watch it. You look like some kind of vagrant anyway. This is a respectable establishment." Sarah looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. For just a moment, something dangerous flashed in her eyes. But then she remembered where she was and what she was trying to be now. "I apologize," she said, her voice steady. "It won't happen again." Jake seemed surprised by her calm response. He'd expected her to either cower in fear or fight back. Instead, she just stood there, waiting for him to let go of her arm. Something about her stillness made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't say why. Just get out of here," he muttered, releasing her arm. Sarah nodded and walked toward the door. Behind her, she could hear the brothers laughing and making crude comments. Every instinct told her to turn around and show them exactly what she was capable of, but she fought those impulses down. She was trying to be someone new now, someone peaceful. As she stepped outside into the afternoon heat, Sarah took a deep breath. The fresh air helped clear her head. She started walking back toward where her truck had broken down, hoping the mechanic she'd called would show up soon. But as she walked, she couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Peterson and the way the Brennan brothers had talked about him. She'd seen enough bullies in her life to know how this story usually ended. Men like the Brennans didn't take no for an answer, and they usually got their way through intimidation and violence. Sarah told herself it wasn't her problem. She was just passing through this town, trying to mind her own business. Whatever happened between the Brennans and Mr. Peterson was between them. She had no obligation to get involved. Still, the image of the kind old man kept coming back to her. He'd reminded her of her grandfather, who had always been there for her when she was growing up. Mr. Peterson had the same gentle way of speaking and the same genuine concern for others. By the time Sarah reached her truck, she made up her mind to stay out of it. She would get her vehicle fixed, maybe spend one more night in Millbrook, and then move on to the next town. She'd find somewhere else to start her new life, somewhere without bullies and conflict. The mechanic arrived an hour later and quickly diagnosed the problem. It would take a day to get the right part, so Sarah was stuck in Millbrook at least until tomorrow. She checked into the small motel on the edge of town and tried to put the Brennan brothers out of her mind. That evening, she walked back into town to find something to eat. Most of the shops were closing, but Peterson's Hardware was still open. Through the window, she could see the old man working alone, organizing inventory on his shelves. Sarah stood outside for several minutes, watching him work. There was something peaceful about the way he moved, carefully arranging each item in its proper place. This was clearly a man who took pride in his work and cared about serving his community. As she watched, a dark sedan pulled up across the street. Sarah recognized Tommy Brennan behind the wheel. He sat there for a few minutes, just staring at the hardware store. The message was clear. He wanted Mr. Peterson to know he was being watched. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists. She'd seen this kind of intimidation before, in places much more dangerous than Millbrook. It always started small, a threatening look, a casual mention of what could happen to someone's business or family. But it escalated quickly if the target didn't give in. After a few more minutes, Tommy drove away. Mr. Peterson had probably never even noticed the car, but Sarah had. She recognized the tactics of someone trying to create fear and pressure. That night, lying in her motel room, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to fall asleep. But every time she closed her eyes, she thought about Mr. Peterson and what might happen to him. She thought about all the times she'd stood by and watched injustice happen, telling herself it wasn't her responsibility. Tomorrow, she told herself she would get her truck fixed and leave Millbrook behind. Whatever happened after that wasn't her problem. She'd done enough fighting for one lifetime. Now she just wanted peace. But deep down, Sarah knew that some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. And something told her that her time in Millbrook wasn't over yet.